Hello, teachers, and welcome back to episode 3 of In the Shadow of Liberty. I am here today with my friend, Kenneth C. Davis, to talk about the great American contradiction, slavery. And we are talking about the stories involved in early American history. And Kenneth C. Davis is the author of In the Shadow of Liberty, The Hidden History of Slavery, 4 Presidents and 5 Black Lives. And my name is Jessica Ellison, and I'm a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society. And today on episode 3, we're going to be talking about Mr. Jefferson's people. So we've already talked about General Washington's people. Now we're moving on to Thomas Jefferson. So we've got some great primary sources here on the screen. But before we dive into the primary sources, we're going to have a little conversation with Ken about Thomas Jefferson and the other gentleman that we see here on the screen. So, Kenneth, hello, good to see you.
Hello again, Jessica. This is one of my favorite stories. Well, I love all these stories, but this is the perfect story to talk about this is the great contradiction in a nutshell. The author of the Declaration of Independence and a man who was his enslaved, a servant for much of his adult life, probably, we don't know for sure, probably born in 1776. And I'm talking about Isaac Granger, who later takes the name Isaac Granger Jefferson. But what better way to talk about slavery and Jefferson and the whole idea of how slavery was a contradiction to the ideas of the Declaration than to talk about someone who Jefferson owned, who was probably born in the year that Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence.
So, like you said, we have talked about George Washington and the contradiction, but if anything, then Thomas Jefferson really does represent an even greater contradiction. So could you tell us a little bit about Jefferson's attitudes towards slavery?
Yes, like Washington, Jefferson is born into the world of the Virginia planter aristocracy, a world completely built upon enslavement. Everything that was owned, possessed, all the wealth acquired, all the wealth held by these people in Virginia came as a result of slavery. It represented their fortunes, it represented their futures. Jefferson grew up with enslaved people around him. One of his childhood friends is a young boy who's probably born in the same year, named Jupiter. That was a common Virginia, tradition to give enslaved people these very high-minded names, naming them after Roman heroes or Greek and Roman gods. So Jupiter is, of course, an enslaved person. Hercules was another popular name. So Jefferson grows up with this child, but then when he goes off to college, the College of William and Mary. Jupiter goes with him, but now he's going as servant. And this is, again, the whole idea of slavery. At some point around the time that Jefferson is a student and even going into his early years as an attorney, he begins to see the contradiction. He's a person who's already talking about the ideals of liberty, the ideals of the Enlightenment period. And one of his first arguments as a lawyer is to argue against slavery. It's the perfect idea of this contradiction that we're talking about. A man completely dependent upon the enslaved world is arguing against slavery. He would take that argument up several other times in his life. And of course, at the most significant moment in his early life, in 1776, he writes the Declaration of Independence and actually writes a very critical passage about slavery in the Declaration of Independence. It was removed by the Continental Congress. They wanted no discussion of slavery. But Jefferson clearly underscores how he thinks that this is an execrable commerce, as he believes it is, and it should end. And he has that paragraph in there. It's taken out, and he was not happy about it. He was not happy about being edited in any respect, but he's certainly not happy about this. But it's the perfect embodiment of this contradiction that we're talking about. How could this man who writes these words and has these ideas still go home to this plantation utterly dependent upon people like Isaac Granger and his family.
So then, who was Isaac Granger? You talked a little bit about Jupiter and Jupiter's relationship with Thomas Jefferson, but Isaac Granger, who was he?
Isaac was the son of a very, very important family in the Monticello extended enslaved family. There were two really crucial families. One is the Hemmingses. We know that name, of course, because of Sally Hemings, but Sally was one of a very large family who went back several generations in the Monticello and Jefferson family. So alongside the Hemmingses, who are central to Jefferson's life, are the Grangers. Isaac Granger's mother was a cook, probably made most of Jefferson's dinners through most of his life. And his father was a very, very prominent member of the African-American enslaved community, who was actually at a certain point elevated to overseer. That means he was given the job of directing the other enslaved people. This was typically a job done by a white man, a free white man, not a job given to an enslaved person. So I think, a very much a symbol of how significant a person Isaac Granger's father was in Jefferson's orbit. When Jefferson is gone to Philadelphia at a certain point, Isaac, as a 14-year-old boy, is taken with him. So it was 1790 when Jefferson goes off to the Washington cabinet. As Isaac goes with him and begins to learn a trade. He learns to become a tinsmith. We also don't know if Isaac could read, but it's suggested that maybe this Quaker tinsmith who was teaching him that trade was also teaching him to read. Jefferson wanted Isaac to learn a trade so that he could come back to Monticello and practice that trade in Monticello. He believed that the only way to end slavery was to be able to give enslaved people skills that they could manage to be free eventually. It was, again, the idealistic Jefferson as opposed to the realistic Jefferson, who still regarded these people as his property and the source of his income. The tinsmithing didn't work out. Isaac begins to actually starts a nail factory at Monticello, and actually produces the most nails. And these were nails that were not only going to be used at Monticello, but then would be sold elsewhere. Jefferson was always looking to turn profits from his enslaved people. But he did believe, again, idealistically, that somehow people like Isaac would eventually be freed, and they would have to have trade so that they could continue to live and work.
So Isaac Granger was really a craftsman then. He first a tinsmith, and then in the making of nails, which is not an easy task. And so I think it's interesting that Jefferson felt like this was the way for him to not only make money for himself, but also eventually to help African Americans survive on their own, which is a contradiction that I think we still see alive today.
Absolutely. And Jefferson certainly would have said and wrote as much that Africans, and certainly African Americans as well, were not the equal of whites. He would have seen them as something in between human and animal. I mean, that's the only way to bluntly put it. So he didn't think that there could be, an educated African American, but he did think that they could still learn a trade. He was very skeptical, for instance, of the poet Phyllis Wheatley, whose many school children learn about her poetry. He didn't think very highly of her abilities as a poet, and he wrote very disparagingly of African American women in particular. Even though he was having a relationship with one. That's, again, why this is such a complicated human story. And I don't think it's a story that we should shy away from talking about with young people. It's really important to understand the contradictions between these men we see as heroic. They're on our money. We have monuments to them, memorials to them. Monticello is one of the most extraordinary places that people from all over the world come and see, but it still is the perfect representation of this contradiction that we've been talking about. And Isaac represented that contradiction as well. He eventually does get liberated. He's emancipated, and we're not clear how he does that, whether he's able to buy his own freedom, which some African-American enslaved people were able to do because they could earn a little money on the side or do other jobs and earn money. But he is eventually a freedman. And as a freedman, late in his life, he tells the story of his life and growing up in Jefferson's Monticello. And it becomes one of the major source materials for biographers of life at Monticello. So it's a very important primary document, the story told by Isaac Granger.
We were talking about Isaac Granger as a craftsman, and I think a lot of people know Thomas Jefferson as a different type of craftsman. I mean, he was a writer and he was an inventor, and if you go to Monticello, you'll see a lot of his inventions and innovations, and this is Jefferson's desk that we see here on the screen. Because of who Jefferson was, this still exists. Now let's think about Isaac Granger and the craftsman work he did. It's likely, it's possible that some of the work he created in the nails that he made at Monticello still exist somewhere, that they are holding up structures. So I think it's an interesting, as we're talking about the juxtaposition of these two lives, the work that both of them did and the importance of that work. One that we still see and that is held up as an example of American innovation, but then one that we don't see as much. And I think that's a really interesting look at the people that we see and the people that we don't see. And so here's a really interesting activity that you could do with your students. So we have a portrait here of Jefferson, and then we have a picture, a photograph of Isaac Granger. So what I think will be interesting to do is to give half of the class this picture of Jefferson and the other half of the class this picture of Isaac Granger. Have them do a very basic observe, think, wonder. What do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? And then with a shoulder partner, swap. And the nice thing about the swap is that students will all see something different than their partner did in these pictures. And then they can talk about it, about what they see that's similar, what they see that's different. What are they wearing? What are the marks of their station in life? But then I really hope they get at this idea that there's a painting of Jefferson, but a photograph of Isaac Granger. And photography, in the grand scheme of things, is a relatively new thing. In our history, we have a picture of a person who was enslaved at Monticello. And the point that I hope that they draw from that is that this history is not that long ago. So these are really great primary sources for your students to dig into, to make sure that they see that these different lives are just as important as the president's lives. Again, here are the resources that include links to the primary sources that we have seen, and then also resources that if you want to get more information, it's bit.ly/S shadow, L Liberty. And if you have any questions, I am more than happy to talk with you about anything. My email is jessica.ellison@mnhs.org. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you for episode 4.